Thank you for joining the Parent Survival Kit podcast, where we focus on from surviving to thriving in your household. My name is Gene Schwalen, and with me I have my beautiful bride, as always, Dr. Sonia Schwalen, licensed psychologist, pediatric expert psychologist, and nationally certified school psychologist. Today we're going to talk about eating habits, when healthy becomes unhealthy. So the last 3 episodes we talked about some different types of gaming addictions, internet addictions, cyberbullying and sexting, and then also Lost in New York. So we're going to kind of jump into some eating habits that can actually be influenced or affected by some of these addictions, and really get into some other types of reasons why kids may develop some eating disorders. So when we talk about gaming and internet addictions, that can definitely cause some unhealthy eating habits. So let's kind of jump in there and see what the doctor has to say.
All right. So last, several episodes we've been talking about, or I think last week, 2 weeks ago was about, addictions and things like that specifically. And absolutely, when we think about the word addiction, the meaning behind it, we spoke about what does that even mean? So someone who's addicted to something will usually sacrifice everything in order to be able to engage in whatever that addiction is. And so despite the negative consequences related to it, or just negative impact on different aspects of life, that person will do the addiction behavior, right? And so in our examples, we've been talking about kids who become addicted to devices or technology. And in that situation, that specific situation, we've seen where kids can stop showing up for regular meals, maybe sleep through breakfast and a morning snack or even lunch because they're staying up all night and gaming or using social media. At that point, I hear stories all the time about kids who are literally sustaining themselves on just snacks out of the pantry. They start to lose a lot of weight. They become dehydrated. They, over time, become weak and just overall unhealthy. Because they're not getting the nutrition that they need. And so that's where the addiction has an impact on that part of their life in terms of physical health, where it can cause medical problems because of how disordered the eating patterns can become.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. There's a lot of research out there that shows problematic internet use as a predictor for eating disorders. And some of the research shows that with the gaming addictions, internet addictions, kids especially, adults too, but when we look at kids, they'll sit there for hours and hours just browsing the internet or playing their games. And so they lose track of time. They are not too concerned about eating because they're so addicted to the game or the internet that they're actually engaging in. And it also shows research that, with the same internet addiction show that when kids are eating or people are eating, they're ordering things online or whatnot, some unhealthy choices to some regard, the choices of foods that they're eating, binging episodes and whatnot. So what do you think about that?
So, you just said binging episodes. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about eating disorders in general. Like, I'm not going to go real specific, but I'll give some examples and kind of what leads up to something like a binge, because part of my expertise is in the treatment of eating disorders. And so when we see kids who may have another addiction, like a technology addiction or some behavior that they're engaging in where they forget to eat or they just don't eat. I mean, I can tell you that it doesn't just happen with kids who are addicted to gaming devices or social media. It's also happening to kids who just prefer to isolate, so they may not be on a screen. Most of them are these days, but they may just be, kind of behind a closed door. They've cut themselves off from family and face-to-face interactions, and they are skipping meals. And so if they're skipping meals, that can lead someone to become very, very hungry. And so over time, it may look like they don't eat for very long, extended amounts of times. And then when they do, they end up eating so much because they're almost making up for the nutrition or the calories that they didn't have throughout the day. And so pediatricians are almost famous for telling parents, don't worry if your kid's not eating, especially if someone's child is on maybe an ADHD medication, which tends to typically be a stimulant medication with a side effect of suppressing appetite. pediatricians commonly will tell parents, your child will find a way to make up for it later. As long as they're eating, don't worry about when or what, just as long as they're getting some food. And I think, we're here to say today that that's not necessarily the case. If you're concerned about your child's eating, if it doesn't match up any pattern that you've ever seen before or that fits even with what's normal for your family, trust those instincts for sure. And many parents will take those concerns to the pediatrician. And like I said, unfortunately, pediatricians will just kind of not worry too much about it, because as long as a child is doing what they need to be doing on their growth curve and continuing to get taller every year and continuing to hit their milestones from that perspective, most pediatricians aren't too worried about it. But because of what I know from just that pediatric psychological standpoint, I say, let's follow mom or dad's gut instinct.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because speaking of pediatricians and growth curves with our kids, it's like if your kid falls at the 15th percentile or the 85th percentile or the 98th percentile, everything's good. As long as you're in that percentile, everything's great. It's like, well, that's a pretty big percentile that we're talking about. That's a big, wide spectrum. And you speak about ADHD stimulants and whatnot, suppressing appetites. Well, let's be honest, screens and gaming and whatnot is also a stimulant. So that's also where suppressive of appetite can come into play. There's also, speaking of healthy and unhealthy choices, with kids on social media as often as they are, following different types of famous people of influence, movie stars, rock stars, or pop stars, whatever you want to call them these days. You also start having comparisons as far as what people look like and whatnot. And so you have a lot of kids who may want to diet or watch what they eat or eat only certain foods because they want to look like this person or have a body image of this person, of what, we think is, I guess acceptable or I guess popular.
Right. And so, with what you just said, with social media and the influence and just comparison that kids can engage in, that goes right along with our bullying episode, right? So I think the statistic about bullying is that the number one most common thing that someone gets bullied about was, what was it? Can you remind me?
Yes, 61% of kids who reported bullying was because of appearance.
Yeah, physical appearance related. So I think what you just said goes hand in hand with that. And so kids are, getting different messages from just our culture in general, where we internalize the thin ideal. So basically what that means is that many people, I think the statistic is if you were to put 10 people in a room, 9 out of 10 people would say that they are unhappy with their body or want to do something to change the way they look. And so that's really, really normal in our society. And that trickles down to our kids. So they see that through social media, maybe what other kids focus on, what they're being bullied about, but they're also seeing it at home. And so because we live in that culture, it's very difficult for us as parents not to be influenced by the same kinds of things. So comparison can start not just because of social media or because some magazine advertisement or something like that, but also because it may be happening in the home.
Yeah, and there's some research that I found also for the National Eating Disorder Association that you're very familiar with. You've done some presentations for them and whatnot. It says 65% of people with eating disorders say bullying contributed to that condition. And then bullying at school can begin at a very young age, as we all know, that we talked about in last week's episode. And it says that children with higher weight bodies are 63% more likely to be bullied than those of thinner peers. So weight and appearance has a huge, huge impact on our kids when it comes to establishing eating disorders.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when we think about even just the development of an eating disorder, we think about several factors that can play into that. And one of the main factors that we know plays into that is the social aspect of it. So there's psychological factors, there's biological factors, but then there's those social factors, right? And so bullying is one of them. Again, the thin ideal, that overall cultural value of the thin ideal and what someone should look like, but then how that trickles down into the home. And so I think that's kind of what we want to talk about today, right? Is all these different things can impact a child and inevitably can either protect a child from developing an eating disorder or can work in some ways to even contribute to those social pressures for why an eating disorder might occur.
Yeah, and that makes sense too. And it's kind of funny. I was listening to Kid Craddock Radio a couple of weeks ago, and what's that movie where they're all a cappella and you have the girls, they're competing? What's that movie called?
I don't know. I'm thinking about like Boys to Men or something.
Anyway, it's a great movie. They actually have a part one and a part two, but Fat Amy's in the movie, and they were talking about her on the radio, how she lost all this weight and whatnot. And there's a lot of concerns. Will she even get any more movie deals? Because she's known as Fat Amy. She's funny. She's hilarious. You look at Jonah. My mind's going blank on these names.
Yeah,
today.
I know who you're talking about, but
Jonah Hill. So,
yeah, there you go.
he lost a lot of weight, and they were concerned whether or not, he was going to be as successful with all the weight he lost because he was fat and funny. Pitch Perfect was the actual movie that I'm speaking of with Fat Amy. So when we look at people who are heavier, we think of they're funny, right? And that's what they're associated as funny. But is that really what's so popular in today, with school and whatnot? There's a lot of kids getting beat up because of these things.
Well, and I'm kind of glad that you brought up those images in pop culture that we see of people who are in larger bodies and tend to go through this journey of weight loss. Because I think it's just so classic. Like that's what people think about, right? And we're here today to start talking about, disordered eating and eating disorders. And it's not just about weight loss or the thin ideal. I mean, that's one of the most classic types of eating disorders that I think a lot of people are familiar with, which is anorexia, right? But there's so many other eating disorders. There's a whole spectrum of eating disorders. And so I always talk about, it's not really about, your weight or how someone looks, because it's really actually very difficult to figure out if someone has an eating disorder just by the way they look. Eating disorders are all about just an unhealthy relationship with food. And so it's the combination of feelings and food and how that kind of gets messy and intertwined. And then, like I said, the biological, the psychological, and the social factors that play a huge role into all of that.
So let's touch on some of those factors and whatnot here in a moment, because I think that's really important for parents to really understand as far as some of these ideals that are out there, things that we're teaching our kids, things that we may be saying in the household, not even knowing what we're really saying in some areas. But before we go there, I also want to bring it really quick, athletes and sports and the impact it has with kids and establishing eating disorders. In fact, the National Eating Disorder Association also has a great report on, athletes and it's dominantly female athletes who are developing eating disorders through different sports, but it does affect males as well. And you have to think of these sports that are really more focused on the individual. So you've got like swimming, you've got gymnastics, you've got cheer, really big from a very, very young age with our kids.
Dance is another huge one.
Another one. And I see it more and more also as a coach myself and coaching basketball. We'd also see girls volleyball being played in some of the same courts that we'd play in. And just sitting back and observing, waiting for games to be played, I'm seeing volleyball parents and whatnot. And I'm hearing comments about, look at this kid and she may not, she's not the thin ideal. She may be a little bit bigger than some of the other kids. And there's comments being made. And you can even see some kids, kind of clustering up and whatnot because they're wearing these really short, tight shorts and whatnot. And kids are noticing these things and parents are bringing it out. And then parents get concerned. Is my kid too big? What's wrong with my kid? Do I need to put my kid on a diet? And a lot of parents really want what's best for their kids. And so they start having some of these conversations, trying to do what's best for their kid, but is that really the right conversation to have? So that kind of leads into some of these things that we may be saying at home.
Well, let's talk about the conversation that we tried to have with our 2-year-old this morning even. So this morning, our 2-year-old woke up and he saw the frosted cookies on the counter. And he said, I want those for breakfast, right? And what was like, how did it go down? What happened? Because I was in the middle of it.
Well, if I remember correctly, and again, it was kind of early this morning, but you were trying to let our 2-year-old know that he couldn't have cookies before breakfast. You have to eat cookies or you have to have breakfast first, then you can have a cookie. So one thing that we've taught in other previous episodes, for those of you who haven't seen some of the other ones, definitely go back and listen, because we talk about you don't ever say no, you always say yes.
You reserve the word no for like true emergency situations, right?
There you go. So we didn't say yes, or we didn't say no, or Dr. Schwinn didn't say no. She said yes, after breakfast, after breakfast. Well, our 2-year-old he's just really adamant, and he wants what he wants, and that's, most 2-year-olds, right? And so she gave up and said, your dad's going to explain this to you, and he'll tell you exactly why you can't have cookies for breakfast. So, of course, I'm dad, and I'm not the eating disorder expert or pediatrician expert either. So I said, yeah, you can't have cookies for breakfast. It's too much sugar. We have those for dessert. So if you eat your breakfast, we'll give you some dessert after breakfast, because those things have sugar or too much sugar.
Right. And then what I decided to tell him behind a closed door, because we're trying to co-parent and present as a united front at all times, was that you can't tell kids that. And so that really goes into this whole, what kind of message are we sending to our kids, right? Because we're not trying to I'm really sensitive about our 2-year-old or any one of our kids having negative connotations with different ingredients, right? So if we start telling him right now, you can't have a cookie because it has too much sugar, that's such a common thing that a parent would tell a child. We need to reduce your sugar intake. You can't drink that juice because it's a sugary drink, or you can't have that soda, or you can't have that cookie. We don't want you to have that much sugar. And I can't tell you how much I hear in clinic even where parents are convinced, and there's probably some truth to it, so I'm not going to downgrade it, but they are just convinced that their child becomes a different person when they've had sugar. My kid is too hyper, or they don't pay much attention, or we're just on this 100% sugar-free diet.
It's a pretty good drug right there.
Pretty restrictive, right? But what we're doing, even at the age of 2, when we explain to a child, you can't have that cookie because it has too much sugar, he doesn't know what that means. But all of a sudden, we're adding meaning now. And the truth is, the cereal that he might eat, instead, or the toast with some jelly that he might eat instead, right? Or the pancakes with syrup that we might give him, all of those also have sugar. But why are we okay with him eating it in that form and not in the cookie form, right? And so we're not actually trying to teach him that sugar's bad. We're just trying to teach him that we want to reserve cookies for a more special occasion. And so we have to be real careful about what we say. It's that communication, though, that parents are doing on a daily basis and may not realize, because even what you were doing this morning, like you thought it was harmless, right? Until I kind of pointed it out to you that, wait, we don't want him growing up like having this negative connotation with sugar. Because I'm really of the mindset that, food is just a source of nutrition. We're going to become real neutral with it. And as long as we're, eating a good variety and teaching our kids how to be open to different things, letting them explore and kind of decide preferences over time, that's a very healthy relationship with food.
I'm glad you said that too, because yesterday when we were watching our older son play tennis and I was with our 2-year-old, he had a pink lollipop, a purple one, and a green one. So we did all these different color exposures for the food he was intaking.
Oh, nice variety. I didn't know about that. But anyways, there's these messages that, with or without realizing it, parents are sending to their kids every day. So some other examples, so it's we have to kind of think about how we talk about food, what kind of message we're sending about certain ingredients on food or different food groups even. But we also need to be aware of how we're talking about physical appearance. And so these types of messages can be very overt. So it's like very obvious, where it's spoken out in the family culture of, we're athletes and we're fit, or we like to stay thin, we're fast. I mean, I know families that do talk like that. And then it can be very covert. So it may not be spoken outright, but it could be something that kids pick up on because they're watching our every move.
Well, let's face it also, I mean, kids are very, very concrete. So they hear something and they take it as that's 100% what it is, no questions asked.
That's right. And so now our little 2-year-old might think he can't have sugar for whatever reason. He probably won't give up on that, but he's starting to internalize that, right?
Well, the key is too, and the problem that we have is that even going back to athletes, I mean, you know, there's emotional feelings that come in, emotional feelings and whatnot that come in that start leading to some of these things. So when I don't feel like I'm performing as well as I should be, or I'm getting a hard time from my mom or my dad about, you know, how I'm performing in sports. Maybe I need to lose weight. Maybe I need to be faster. Maybe this is going on, and then we start putting those things to food.
That's exactly right.
And that's when the problem comes in.
And that's that like convoluted, messy relationship with food. And I've even heard it from coaches. And I know, you know, you have the coaching background. I can't tell you how many times clients that I treat will come into the clinic and tell me stories about coaches, you know, dance coaches, gymnastics, track, cross country, wrestling, even for boys. I see that a lot.
Yep.
Where coaches will literally do a body shaming in front of the team members. You know, you're never going to succeed. You're not going to get as far as your teammates until you know, lose some weight or tighten up here or tighten up there or whatever it is. And so there's constant focus on body and body image, and it's negative. And kids start to feel really, really bad about themselves, you know. So that's from that perspective. But
and going into the coaches really quick too. I mean, just you see that in a lot of ways too. A lot of these coaches, it starts at a very young age. Like these select coaches, both for boys and for girls, it's some of them are paid and they want to go to the next level, and so they want to succeed more than the kids want to succeed in a lot of ways. And then you think about also, I remember Andre Agassi back in the day. His biggest campaign he ever did was images everything, you know, and that still is here today. All these things are ingrained in us from when we were kids that we're saying today. Our parents said these things to us. Now we're saying them to our kids automatically, and it continues the cycle.
Right. And again, it's, you know, we don't mean to do this for the most part. We don't even know we're doing it. The sugar example from this morning is a really great example of, you know, you didn't think about that at all when you said it. And I kind of left it to you. I was like, okay, Daddy will explain this to you, because even in that moment, I was just done. But the covert examples that I really want to kind of bring light to, just because I think it will help parents kind of think through some of the things that they may or may not be doing without realizing it. So this is small stuff, you know, but it sends a loud message. It might be the way, you know, mom or dad talk about the way they look in the mirror. You know, do I look fat in this? Or, oh, I hate my outfits. I just can't find anything that I feel good in or that looks good on me. So those are some comments that, you know, a little girl or a little boy who walks into the bathroom all the time because they're young will pick up on. And that self-critical type of talk is also another thing that kids really pick up on. I always say that if you want your child to be a confident person who really believes awesome things about themselves, let them watch you and hear you say awesome things about yourself. Because if they see you doing that, they're more likely to do that, right? And then it's the parents that might, you know, park far away and walk just so they can get extra steps. Or the ones who want to close their rings, right, on their watch, and they kind of check.
Yeah, I know somebody like that.
They check the steps they're taking. It might be the parents who diet in front of their children and don't think the kids are paying any attention to it, but kids really do pick up on whether or not different food groups are missing from a parent's meal plan. It can be the way parents pick up different magazines and scroll to different articles or whatever they're looking at on social media. If it has like somewhat of a common theme where body image or that bikini body or whatever it might be is part of it, your kids are going to pick up on that.
Yeah, it could even be comments that we make when we see other people and whatnot that we just, you know, say, outwardly that we don't really know if anyone's even paying attention. So
Right. And so many times parents think like, oh, I never meant for that to happen, or I didn't even think they were paying attention. But that's it. Our kids watch everything we do, and they compute it. Over time they start to understand, oh, okay, like I have to be thin, or I have to look a certain way. That's what's accepted here. Or I'm not allowed to eat this much food just anytime I want to. There's rules around everything. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be, right? We have to like teach our kids what's good for them and what's not, obviously. But we don't have to also make it so horrible where we say, well, it has sugar in it, you can't eat it. We have to find other ways to communicate about why variety is healthy.
yeah, so it's not the food or the ingredient, it's the habit.
Yes.
So you can have a soda, you just can't have 10 sodas back to back to back.
Right. It's like, we as parents, and this is a real famous saying by a well-known dietitian out there that works with younger kids. We as the parents need to provide and then allow the children space to decide. And then just like anything else in their life, we have to give them guidance when they're learning how to make good, critical decisions about their health and their life. So we don't just leave it to their own devices, because if that were to happen, that would be, us being negligent as parents. But if we want to be, responsible, step up and show them what's okay and how to eat balanced and good and variety, and just kind of have more neutral outlook on food, we need to model that ourselves.
Yeah, and I remember you actually telling me a long time ago with our 7-year-old, just bringing it to my attention that, when you, especially with little girls, one of the things that dads usually say all the time is, you're so beautiful, you look so beautiful. And they are beautiful, but they're also beautiful no matter what, right? But let's try to refrain from saying you're so beautiful all the time, and let's give them different compliments. You're so smart, you're so creative. I love the way you put that outfit together, versus talking about looks.
Right. And so that physical appearance, I mean, we are, visual creatures by nature. We respond to what we see. It's one of the first things that we process. And so it's very intentional on our part to not comment all the time on physical appearance or make it so important, whether it be for us or for our kids. We want to highlight other aspects of just what makes them who they are, and what we want them to know about them as a person, and and what their character is.
Yeah, so we're talking about eating habits and when healthy becomes unhealthy. So why don't you sum up what it really means, just bottom line, when healthy becomes unhealthy?
Okay. So in my clinic, I do treat a lot of kids and adults who have different kinds of eating disorders. And when it's a child, I usually find that the child and their eating disorder tend to reflect at least some of what's going on in the parent-child relationship. Not all of it, because like with teenagers, they have other influences on their life, such as friends and social network and social media even. With really young kids, though, it's a lot of it in terms of what's going on in the parent-child relationship. And then I can see how the child interacts with food to really understand what's happening in the parent-child relationship. And so what I've noticed, that whole like when healthy becomes unhealthy, is usually when parents get really stuck in their own heads about what they think is healthy and what they think is unhealthy. And then they end up passing down all of these morals about food and rules about food to their children, when really kids are young, they're growing, and what's healthy for them is going to be very different than what's really healthy for an adult. And so I always say, there's really not healthy or unhealthy foods. We kind of want to stay away from that. We really want to think about people being healthy or unhealthy. And so what an adult needs is going to be very different than what a growing child needs. And nutrition is truly a science. I've learned that from my dietitians that work with me on my team, that there's just different things that go into considering what someone really needs and how to keep them growing and how to keep them well. And we can't put all of our rules on that. So a really good example that I have of this is actually someone that I just spoke to recently, who called up and said, my daughter is 5 years old and is an extremely picky eater. And when I kind of got to know a little bit more about what was going on, there's not a lot there in terms of like what would cause this child to be a picky eater, except the mom's own anxiety about different foods. And so, as I learned more, I realized that this child was diagnosed with a peanut allergy at a very young age, and it scared mom. This was her first child. It scared her to think about her baby having an anaphylactic reaction and something really bad happening or potentially losing her child. And so the child's relationship with food, because of mom's anxiety, became extremely restrictive. And there were so many rules around what was okay and what was not okay and how to think about food now, that child had become so restrictive that they were eating only just a few foods. So again, the relationship with food in a kid can tell me a lot about what's going on in the parent-child relationship.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And thinking about it also, I mean, it's not even really necessarily, which this does happen a lot, but as you mentioned, but it's not necessarily also what we teach our kids about healthy or unhealthy foods. It could also be kids going back to isolation and gaming. Are parents involved? What are they doing? Are they working all the time and kids are just fending for themselves? There's a lot of factors that can go into it as well. So parents definitely are a reflection, or kids are definitely a reflection of their parents. Parents definitely have some part to play in the development of the kids and what's going on. There's a lot of emotional factors that can play in, as we mentioned, with bullying and whatnot, anxiety, depression, trauma. And then with sports and athletes, you definitely have the pressures of succeeding, the thin ideal, different factors there as well. The bottom line is, when it comes down to our kids and the habits they form around food, who's teaching our kids? Are we teaching our kids, and what are we teaching them? Or are they learning it from somewhere else? Because if we're not teaching them, they are going to find the resources somewhere else.
Exactly.
With the access to the internet. So,
yeah.
from what I'm hearing, it sounds like the best tip to help our kids is to really go around tooting your own horn. I'm amazing. I'm beautiful. I am gorgeous. I am creative.
Absolutely. So you heard that. That's absolutely one tip for this week, is go ahead and let your kids hear you. Just engage in your own self-affirmations, and you can make it a little bit more natural of, hey, guess what mama did today? She helped a bunch of people because she's an awesome doctor,
There she goes to their own horn again.
But letting them hear you say that about yourself is definitely key. It allows them to understand what a positive self-statement even sounds like. It takes the focus off of what you look like and more about who you are in terms of your character. And then the second tip is just kind of step back a little bit and study your own relationship with food, or your own thoughts and biases about different food groups, because that can really give you some insight into what you may or may not be conveying to your child without even knowing it. Those are the two tips for this week. Now, based on everything that you just summarized, with all the different factors that kind of contribute to different eating patterns in kids, I just want to point out that you've highlighted the fact that this is extremely complex. Nutrition is complex. Our relationship with food is super complex. And I think because of that, we're definitely going to focus on the Red Clinic podcast, the other one that I do, in terms of how to navigate nutrition in a very complex world. And so I want to just plug that here, because in case parents want to tune into that, I absolutely want them to know that that's another resource that's available for them.
Yeah, it's, as parents, it's like our job never ends. We talked about, unplugging for the last 3 episodes and social media devices. And it's like that itself is a full-time job. And now we've got all this eating habit information now. So if you have questions, definitely reach out, leave comments and whatnot. We have experts on our staff at Next Steps Worldwide that can definitely help you navigate some of these things. It is a complex world when it comes to navigating nutrition. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry when it comes to dieting and whatnot. So there's all kinds of information out there. Most of it's really not the right information you want to give your kids, especially. And we do have a podcast that's going to be launching this coming Sunday for the Red Clinic podcast that does talk about getting back to the basics. So definitely check that out because it's going to be focused on really eating habits around kids, a lot more detail and whatnot. So we do thank you for joining in today, and we can't wait to see you again next week. Thanks again. Thank you for tuning in to the Parent Survival Kit, from surviving to thriving in your household. We are so glad that you tuned in today, and we'd also ask that you subscribe to our podcast to receive your weekly episodes. We also love to hear from our listeners, so if you have questions or comments or want to share one of your stories, we do respond to all of our listeners, and who knows, your story may inspire one of our future episodes. If you can't get enough of the Parent Survival Kit podcast, click on one of the episodes below and continue to listen on to all the great things that we love to share. Thanks again for tuning in, and God bless.